This afternoon, we are at the law offices of Dunn, McDonald, and Reynolds. And we're here in connection with the Legal History Project. And this afternoon, I'm going to interview a long-term friend of mine and a wonderful lawyer who's been retired for quite some time. And his name is Earl Layman. Earl, it's like starting to examine a witness. They suggest that we ask you to state your full name and date of birth.
My name is Earl Robert Layman, and I was born August 5th, 1932, right here in Knoxville, Tennessee.
And we're not going to put you under oath today. So this, of course, is in connection with the legal heritage history situation.
I understand.
I'm going to interview you here, and I want to say that it's a pleasure to be here to interview you, and it's an honor also.
Well, it's an honor for me, Paul, to be interviewed, and it's an honor for you to do it.
I'm going to start right at the very beginning. Earl, you were born in Knox County, were you?
Yes, I was.
And you are now
83 earlier this month.
83 earlier this month. Well, tell me who your parents are.
My parents were William Earl Layman and Marie Frances Little Layman.
And where did you live, Earl, or where were you born?
Well, my parents lived on Burns Road. It's just off of Holston Drive, about halfway between Burlington and Chill High School, just outside the city limits of Knoxville. And I lived there from the time I was born until I left home to go into military service.
And your father, as I recall, he was a lawyer.
Yes, he was.
And with whom did he practice, Earl?
He practiced with Ben Winnick. That's Bernie Bernstein's father-in-law, and Max Morrison. Max Morrison left after a short period of time, and then Ben Winnick died, and Dad practiced with Reuben Nichols for a while before he went on the bench as a General Sessions judge.
And then, as I recall, your dad went on the bench in 1964, did he not?
That's correct.
And a word of remembrance of Judge Layman. He is deceased now.
Yes, he is. He died in 1974.
He was a wonderful judge. He had a high degree of integrity and worked hard and was kind to everybody.
He was very compassionate, but he was he could be strict at times, and he could hand out punishment when it was called for.
You may have been on the receiving end of that.
Well,
when you were a child.
no, not really, not really. My dad was somehow or another he managed to get along without corporal punishment, and at least I thought he did a very good job. He was. No boy ever had a finer dad than mine.
Now tell us something about your mom.
My mom's name was Marie Frances Little. She was born and raised she was born in St. Clair, Alabama. She was raised in Etowah County, Alabama. Her father was a tenant farmer, a sharecropper. She attended Jacksonville State Normal College at Jacksonville, Alabama for a while. I don't know how they swung that financially, but and I don't know how long she attended Jacksonville State, but she attended long enough to get a teaching certificate, and she taught a while in the Etowah County schools. She was here to go to Drawn's Business College when she met my dad. Apparently, Drawn's had a reputation throughout the South at that time as being a good business school, and that's why she was here, and they met and were married in 1929.
I understand and recall that she had a rather long life.
She died last year at the age of 109.
She was about the third or fourth oldest in the United States, wasn't she?
Well, I don't think there's any statistics on that, but you very seldom see or hear of anyone as old. I've been reading obituaries for a long time, and I've never seen the obituary of anybody as old.
Earl, did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had one brother. He's 4 years younger than I. He was a chemical engineer with Monsanto in Panama City, Florida, and then he came back here after he retired.
Now, when you started school, where did you go initially?
Went to Chilhowie Elementary School, which was about a mile east of where we lived. Went there for 8 years, walked to school and back every day. Have very pleasant memories.
And now after the 8th grade, you started to a junior high school?
No. The county system was 8 years of grade school and 4 years of high school. And we lived in the county. I went to Central High School, and of course that was a substantial difference away. Knox High was about half as far away, but Knox High was a city school, and of course I was in the county, so I went to Central High School 4 years.
After Central High School, you graduated in 1950 from Central High School.
I did, yes.
During your period of school, did you have a part-time job?
Yes, I delivered newspapers for the Knoxville News Sentinel. I had my first route when I was 11. I think I had 3 or 4 in all, but the last one, it was a good one. And I delivered papers every afternoon after I got out of high school. I'd come home and deliver my newspaper out.
And I'm going to ask a little bit about your family. You, as I recollect, have a total of 4 children.
I do.
All fine children, I might add.
Well, I'm proud of them. Not a one of them ever gave me a minute's trouble. Between the 4 of them, they have 6 degrees, all from the University of Tennessee.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, Doug, the oldest, is a doctor, a medical doctor, and he specializes in radiology. Marilyn is a professor of English at Rowan State in Oak Ridge. The youngest 2 are twin girls, identical twin girls. Linda is a graphic artist, and she's in the ORNL organization. Sherry is her title is executive assistant or something like that. She's at Y12.
Now, do all of your children have children?
Yes, they do. I have 9 natural grandchildren and 2 step-grandchildren. One of my daughters married a man that had 2 children by a previous marriage. I also now have 4 great-grandchildren.
Now, Earl, after high school, did you start to college then?
I did. I started to the University of Tennessee, and the Korean War broke out in June, I believe, after I graduated from high school in early June or late May. I turned 18 in August and was A1, or 1A, I guess it was, for the draft. In other words, my days were numbered. But when I started at UT in September, there was a fellow there in a military uniform, and he made me a deal I couldn't refuse. He told me that if I would commit myself for 4 years of ROTC and a total of 8 years thereafter, 2 years on active duty, that I would be a commissioned officer. And one of the best things about it was my last 2 years of ROTC, I would be paid $22 and some odd cents a month. So I gobbled that up and took ROTC, and then served my time in the military after I graduated.
Now, while you're undergraduate school, what What was your major?
Well, I started in pre-law, and I got to staring at that 6 years, and I didn't want to go to school for that long, and I made a very unfortunate decision to change majors to accounting. I never had any aptitude for accounting. I was lousy with numbers, but I got my degree in accounting, and then of course went in the service.
And tell us about your military service. Where did you serve? And
I served at Fort Benning, Georgia for about 7 or 8 months. That was training and school, and then I served the rest of my 2 years at Fort Hood, Texas, 510th Armored Infantry Division, 510th Armored Infantry Battalion, 4th Armored Division.
And when were you discharged?
Well, I wasn't actually discharged. I had a commitment. I had to stay in the reserves for another 6 years, but I was separated from active duty in April of 1957. Came back to Knoxville to look for a job.
Now, you and your wife had children by that time?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. We had
probably Doug?
Doug, the oldest. He was born in the military hospital at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Well, tell us, when you started looking for a job, what job did you look for and what did you find?
Well, as I say, I was not a particularly gifted accountant. I took a job with East Tennessee Packing Company, which was at that time was a medium-sized slaughterhouse and meat packing operation over off on Sphere Avenue. And I stayed there. I was payroll clerk. I stayed there for almost 2 years, and I saw that there was no chance for advancement, and I then took a job in Nashville with Genesco, formerly General Shoe Corporation, in the internal auditing department. After I'd been there for 3 or 4 months, they wanted to put me on the road auditing retail stores, and I didn't want to do that, so I quit that job. Came back to Knoxville, took a job with Rich's Department Store as office manager of the interior decorating department. Well, I was fitted for that job about like a square peg is for a round hole. And I was supposed to supervise the decorators, and what happened, they all got mad and left. Then there was nothing for me to do, so they fired me. At that time, I decided that there must be a better way. There must be something else in life for me, and I made the decision to go to law school.
And what year did you enter law school?
Entered law school in September of 1960. Went over to apply, and Dr. Elvin Overton interviewed me, and he looked at my undergraduate record, and he said, well, he said, you have a degree, and we have to let you in, but you're wasting your time. That didn't add to my confidence any.
So he gave you a few words of encouragement.
Well, he scared the whiz out of me anyway.
Well, I'm fearful I was a victim of the same.
He may have said that
interview with Elvin Overton.
He may have said that to just about everybody. I don't know, but my undergraduate grades were not very good at all.
Now, so when did you graduate?
Graduated in December of 1962 with some.
Now, I understand that, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I understand that you were very active in the student bar.
I was president of the Student Bar Association. I was, I believe, maybe secretary of my legal fraternity. I remember those 2 offices I held.
And when did you finish your law school?
Graduated in December of 1962. I went through 9 straight quarters. Took the bar in February of '63.
And after taking the bar, did you obviously passed it? And then did you go to work practicing law?
Yes, I actually I looked for a job, as most of us did. We looked for a connection before we graduated. I was very much in debt at the time. I'd gone in debt to go to law school, and I was offered a job with Swafford, John and Taylor in Chattanooga, a tax firm. They offered me $450 a month, and that was
substantial.
Oh, that was a good deal of money for a beginning lawyer at that time. But it was a tax firm, and that kind of scared me a little bit. And they assured me that this was tax law, this was not accounting. And they interviewed me and introduced me to the junior partner, and there, sitting on his desk, was a calculator. Well, that scared me off from Swafford, John and Taylor. I took a job with Joyce and Wilson. That was Frank Wilson's firm. Frank Wilson had gone on the federal bench at that time in Chattanooga. And Gene Joyce and Riley Anderson, Joe Woods were the lawyers. I stayed with them for about a year and a half. Ran into Dean Warner somewhere one day, and I wasn't exactly happy. I was mostly searching titles and closing loans. I wanted to go to court. Ran into Colonel Warner, and he inquired as to whether I was happy in my circumstances, and I told him I wasn't. I really wanted to work for a firm that tried cases. Well, a couple of weeks later, I'm sitting in my office, and the receptionist buzzed me and said, "Dean Warner's on the phone for you." I answered the phone. "Layman, this is Warner. You still looking to make a change?" I said, "Yes, Colonel, I am." He said, "How'd you like to go with Key and Lee?" Well, there was a long silence, and I said, "Colonel, that would be absolutely great." He said, "Well, give Mac Lee a call. They're looking for somebody. Bill Dorn has left. He was their associate, and they're looking for somebody. And I mentioned you to them, and they seemed interested." So I called Mac, and he...
that's McAfee
That's
Lee.
McAfee Lee. We set up an interview. He and Clyde Key interviewed me together and hired me before we left the room. It was a really great fit.
Now, that firm of Key and Lee, it had quite a history, didn't it?
It did. It began shortly after the war between the states, when a Confederate veteran named George Wesley Pickle and a lawyer named Turner founded the firm. And actually, it was one of the longest practicing law firms in Tennessee, I think. But it evolved, the name changed down through the years, and it was Key and Lee when I went with them.
Now, in addition to practicing there at Key and Lee, did you take a position with the University of Tennessee College of Law?
I did. I worked in a part-time teaching position as the practicing lawyer who counseled and guided the students in the legal aid clinic, and I enjoyed that very much. I spent 2 afternoons a week over there, and I'd go to court on occasionally. Well, I was in divorce court every Friday with a stack of ex parte divorce cases under the files under my arm. But I enjoyed that very much, and I quit when I just had more to do in the firm than I couldn't spare the time for it anymore. So I stayed there for 4 years part-time.
Key and Lee, can you tell me a little bit about Mr. Key, whom I knew well, and McAfee Lee, whom I also knew? They're wonderful people.
Mr. Key, they both were wonderful people. Mr. Key was held in very high esteem by the bar. He was, as far as just having a legal knowledge and the ability to apply it, I think lots of people think he was one of the best. Mac his talents were a little bit different. He was a very astute lawyer. He had a very good knowledge of the law, but his forte was his ability to persuade a jury. And he was so good at it that he could persuade a judge too. I've gone to court with him when I didn't think he had a prayer to win the lawsuit. I remember one particular in Chancery Court before Chancellor Charles Dawson, and I didn't think he had a prayer. And boy, we walked out of there, and he had convinced Charlie Dawson of his position. He was good. I tried to learn from both of them, but Mac was more my mentor than Mr. Key was.
Did you have a particular area of the law that you practiced in with the firm? The firm had more defense or more plaintiffs? Or
no, it was basically a personal injury defense firm. They had a number of insurance company clients, and the Southern Railway was, Mr. Key handled the Southern Railway business. And the two of them had a whole lot more than they could handle when I went with them. They let me take on responsibility as fast as I could assume it. And Mac would give me a file to go take a deposition or file an answer or do something with it. And we played a little game, I guess. I wouldn't give it back to him, and he'd never ask me for it. So I was able to progress very quickly.
So you, over the course of your career, you obviously represented quite a number of target defendants.
I did. Mr. Key, he was trying to slow down. Of course, he did the railroad work, and I remember for a number of cases, I'd gone with him to court and kind of carried his briefcase. One morning, we had a FELA case, and I better explain a little bit about what an FELA case is. It's a employee suit. The railroad is not covered by workers' compensation, but the employee can sue. He gets a jury trial. Contributory negligence is not a bar. And to make a long story short, they were very difficult cases to defend. This was a serious case. J.D. Lee had filed, and it was set for trial in one of the circuit courts. I don't remember which one. But I come in that morning thinking I'm going to carry his briefcase and he's going to try the lawsuit. And he says, "Earl, I don't feel well today. You and Monty was a railroad claim agent. You and Monty go down and try this lawsuit." Well, I did, and I guess we didn't get hit too bad. The verdict was reasonable. It was clearly a case of liability and just a question of how much. So from then on, I handled most of the railroad work. He wanted me to if I could. He was getting kind of lazy at that point in his life. Then he died in 1979, and I had the railroad then as my exclusive client. We represented a number of insurance companies, Aetna, John Hancock, Metropolitan, and Aetna had a lot of business, so I did a lot of work for them. I handled a lot of workers' compensation early on.
You mentioned an FELA case. Many of those were filed in federal court.
Many were. Some were filed in, some lawyers like to file them in state court, some of them would rather file them in federal court, and some of them seemed to file them in both for no apparent reason why they chose one or the other. J.D. Lee had an awful lot of litigation against the railroad, and he and I tried many, many cases down through the years.
Now, the judge at that time in federal court was someone who lawyers of our vintage remember very well, and his name is Robert Taylor.
Yes, yes.
And you related to me one time that you had an FELA case there, and which didn't appear to be any liability, and the judge made a remark to you regarding that.
Judge Taylor sounded his docket twice a year at that time, and he always set the FELA cases first. His philosophy was that they were like a workers' comp. The man needed his money, and he set them at the beginning of the term. Well, as Judge Taylor would often do, he'd kind of shake his finger at you, and he'd say, now, why don't you settle this case? Well, this particular one, and I can't remember exactly the facts, but there was some question about whether there was any negligence at all that could be proven against the railroad. And I said, well, Your Honor, there's serious question about the liability here. And he said, well, he got hurt on your railroad, didn't he? That wasn't very encouraging, but that was Judge Taylor. That was the way he looked at FELA cases. If he got hurt on your railroad, he was owed money.
That makes your day. Well, now, you continued with the firm until Mr. Lee died.
Yes, Mac died in 1982 of lung cancer.
Now, Mac's father, he was a lawyer also, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. His name was Baxter Lee, and he was appointed federal judge back sometime, I guess, in maybe the early 40s, maybe late 30s. But he and Mr. Key were associated in a lawsuit, and they went down to talk to Judge Taylor. That was the earlier Judge Taylor. That was not the Judge Taylor we'd just been discussing. But Mac's dad, while they were sitting there in the judge's office, he had a heart attack and fell over in Mr. Key's lap. He was appointed federal judge and waiting to be sworn in at the time.
And died there of a heart attack.
Died there of a heart attack. They got a doctor from the Medical Arts Building right across the street, but I think he was dead, or essentially dead, when the doctor got there.
When did you cease active practice law?
I retired in May of 1993. I was, excuse me.
May of 1993?
Yes.
So that's sort of an early retirement.
Yes, I think there was some speculation that I had a terminal cancer or something, and some people said, you know, you're 60 years old, you're right at the height of your career. Why do you want to retire? And I think, in looking back, there were a couple of reasons. Probably first and foremost, after McAfee died, the practice of law was never the same for me. He was not only my mentor, he was a big brother I never had, and actually, in a way, sort of, he was a second father to me. He was 15 years older than I, and we practiced law together 18 years. We never had an argument. We never had a crossword at all. We could have some pretty lively arguments about law. We used to argue each other's lawsuit to each other. We'd play the devil's advocate with the other, and but that was the only thing we ever argued about. And something was taken out of it for me after Mac died. I think another reason that I wanted to retire that early was the practice of law seemed to change quite a bit. There was things got more formal. In the early days of my law practice, you never filed a motion for. Well, I should say you never filed a notice to take depositions. Lots of times you didn't file a notice if there was something you had a question about. You'd call the other lawyer and say, hey, don't you think, can you agree to this? And a lot of times, oftentimes, you'd get an agreement. You didn't have to go file a motion. And that was changing. The practice of law was becoming more formalized. Of course, I began to see financially that I could swing it, and I developed a couple of other inners that I like to work on. So I did retire at age 60.
Earl, while you were practicing, representing target defendants, I know you must have had many close calls, shall we say, and sleepless nights and all these other things when you got multi-million dollars hanging in the balance. Do you recall, or could you recall a few of your more remembered cases? I
sure can. I don't know where to start. You know, I didn't try as many lawsuits as a lot of lawyers did. You tried a whole lot more than I did. Bill Groover, he was trying lawsuits almost all the time. But when I did try one, it usually was a quite substantial lawsuit. I don't know where to start. There was one that particularly I remember, crossing accident at Middlebrook Pike, Millertown Pike, up east of John Sevier Yards. And the young couple was going to work one morning, and the train hit the car on the passenger side. The young woman, who had three young children, all girls, she was killed. The boy, I call him a boy, I guess he was around 30. He claimed to have brain damage, and that was another J.D. Lee case, and we tried it. We took discovery depositions. I routinely asked the young man if he'd remarried, and he said no. Seemed to be rather indignant about it. Well, the railroad claim department got a call from somebody that lived in his neighborhood that said he had gone to Georgia and married his 17-year-old babysitter. Sure enough, when we checked the county court clerk's office in Ringgold, Georgia, and there it was. So when we tried it, he testified quite at length about his babysitter and how much he paid her, and I said, well, I questioned him. Does she come in the morning and leave in the evening, or does she stay over? Oh no, she leaves in the evening. But that line of questioning went on for a while, and J.D., I think he thought I was just kind of digging my hole, and he didn't object. And finally I said, well, you're married to Brenda. Brenda was the babysitter. I said, you're married to her, aren't you? He said, why, no. And I walked over to the claim agent sitting at the counsel table, and he handed me the marriage certificate, and I unfolded it and held it up in front of the young man, and I said, well, isn't this your marriage certificate where you married Brenda on such and such a date? He looked at it, and he looked at it. Well, of course, when I said that, J.D. came out of his chair like he was jet propelled. Quite properly, Judge Haynes overruled his objection at that point in time because it went to the witness's credibility. J.D. took an on-suit, and then we settled the case. But that's one I remember vividly.
That's one to remember, all right.
Of course, that's one of the ones that I got a good result. I didn't get a good result in all of them.
Well, what was your most disappointing result that you got? Do you recall that?
Well, the biggest judgment I ever gave up was $900,000 in a crossing accident. Ron Mears represented the plaintiff, who was a 17-year-old boy, and he was comatose. I represented CSX in that lawsuit. There were 18 what we call whistle witnesses that testified either the horn did or did not blow, and 18 of them testified it didn't blow. So it was a hard lawsuit to defend, but that was the biggest judgment I gave up.
Now, one thing I forgot to mention, and it's very important, is I think you were very active politically, weren't you, in your early years of the practice?
Somewhat. I was on the election commission. I was president of the Young Republican Club at one time. I was on the state Republican Executive Committee, and I began to interfere with the law practice, and I really didn't have much choice to make. I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't want to be a politician, so I pretty much gave it up. I've been a voter ever since then. That's about all, as far as politics goes.
Earl, we've thought about some additional lawsuits, and I recall one that your partner, James Wagner, who's a mighty fine young man, whereby you had some demonstrative evidence, we refer to it as.
I kind of cringe when I look back on that one because I did something a little reckless, but
exactly what I thought when you told it to me. Seemed sort of reckless.
It was tried in federal court in Greenville, and I can't remember that plaintiff's lawyer's name. He was from Upper East Tennessee, and he did a good job in getting his lawsuit prepared. But his client was a fellow who had chosen to sit down on the railroad tracks and drink beer, and he did, and he got sleepy and went to sleep. Fortunately for him, he was lying between the rails. The train, as the train approached, the crew saw him from quite some distance away, and the engineer put the train into an emergency brake application, but couldn't get it stopped until I think there were about 4 engines in the lead on the train, and I think he was under the 4th one when the train finally stopped. And I remember the testimony was that the first thing he said to the crew when they got out of the train and ran back to see about it, he said, "Get this big MF off of me." He was under the 4th engine. But anyway, when the case was tried,
that may have been his beer talking.
Well, it woke him up anyway. When the case was tried, the opposing lawyer had an expert witness who was I had used many times and had cross-examined him many times. His name was Alex Moore. He was with the engineering department at UT, and he was a very fine witness, very fine engineer, and I was always impressed by his integrity. Well, in cross-examining him, I was able to establish that there was approximately 8 seconds between the time the whistle blew, when the crew saw him and the engineer blew the whistle, and the lead engine got to him and went over him. So I asked Alex Moore, I said, "You got a second hand on your watch there?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, now I want you to time, James Wagner was helping me try the case. And I said, "James, you sound the horn, you go toot toot, and then Professor Moore, you look at your watch, and when 8 seconds have elapsed, you tell us that 8 seconds have elapsed." Well, then I laid down on the floor, and James, I'm simulating the plaintiff. James says toot toot, and I get up and dust myself off and go over and stand against, lean my elbow in the windowsill, and after 8 seconds, Alex Moore says 8 seconds. Well, it demonstrated pretty clearly that the fellow had plenty of time to get up from the time the horn blew and get out of the way of the train. And looking back, it was a very reckless thing to do, but I got away with it.
You thought about all those what ifs.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, in preparing for this today, I talked to a number of your neighbors, trying to turn up some dirt on you, and I found none. But they speak very highly of you, Earl. Your prior partners, they frequently use the word skilled, high degree of integrity, a hard worker, and speak that you do the right thing and that you're a wonderful lawyer. I just
Well,
thought
those
I'd
are
share that.
those are mighty kind words.
I just thought I'd share that with you. Now, I had one neighbor that you live across the street from him,
Bill McReynolds.
Bill McReynolds, and Bill said, Paul, Earl would be the best neighbor. He's been the best neighbor I've ever had my entire life, except, and there is one exception, he said, in the fall of the year, don't give him any matches when everything gets dry and ready to burn. And so that whetted my interest a little bit. Do you recall anything that might result from that?
I think, excuse me, what Bill is referring to, I was burning brush, tree limbs, clippings and so forth. And I went into the house to get a glass of water, I believe. Well, anyway, I live on a very steep bluff that goes down to the river. It's almost too steep to walk on, but not quite so steep as to pose the danger of generally falling off of. But anyway, my fire was near the lip of the bluff, and a burning log rolled out of the fire and rolled down the bluff and set a path of fire as it went in the dry. It was very dry. I probably shouldn't have been burning brush, but anyway, when I came back out, the bluff was on fire. It was very dry down there, and over the years, people had cut trees to enhance the view, and left the tree and left the stump. To make a long story short, I spent the night out there with a fire hose. I was afraid to go in, with a garden hose, I should say. And it seemed like that when I thought I had a burning stump out, and I directed my stream of water somewhere else, that stump would flare back up again. And I was afraid to go in the house. I was afraid that it would spread. So Bill has kind of kidded me about that a few times since.
A few times. Earl, you also have become quite an author since you retired. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the interests that I had, and I guess it influenced me in retiring, when I was a little boy, I'd listen to my dad and my uncle and my grandmother talk about family history, and about all they knew was that my great-great-grandfather, who was believed to be of German descent, but he had come to Tennessee from Pennsylvania. Back of that, they knew nothing, and I was determined to trace my lineage back to the ancestor. Anyway, after I'd done that, I didn't know when to quit. The bug had bit me, so I kept going. I researched all the Laymans descended from early immigrants, and I've written 3 books. This is the one I'm probably is best known. I called it Layman spelled 2 ways, Genealogy Handbook, but I traced the immigrants downstream, and people tracing their family going backwards in time can connect with it. And it's been very helpful to a lot of people in tracing their ancestry, and I'm very proud of it.
And I'm sure many, many hours of work went into that.
Well, it was a labor of love. As I say, when I got interested in it, I didn't know when to quit. I wrote one book on the work I did in Switzerland, trying to trace my ancestor back to his Swiss roots. And then the first one I wrote was just simply about my line from my immigrant ancestor down through my grandchildren.
You had a very interesting life, Earl. You're very, very fortunate.
The good Lord's been good to me, Paul.
Now, the last question here, next to the last question, I guess. Anything else that you'd like to say that would like to tell us about that we?
Well, another thing that probably caused me to influence me in retiring early, I've always had an interest in faraway places with strange sounding names. When I was a little boy, I collected stamps, and I'd look at a stamp from Thailand or Siam, I guess it was then, and I sure would like to go there. So anyway, I have traveled a good deal, and I do enjoy it. The world has, according to most counts, 196 countries, and I've been to 122 of them.
Well, are you going to make the 196?
No, there's no way to make them all, but I've got a trip planned next week to Albania, Bulgaria, Kosovo, and Macedonia. And when I get back from that one, I will have been to every country in Europe except 4.
It sounds like you do a lot of traveling and have done a lot of traveling.
I have, and I still love to do it. I have no intention of quitting until old Father Time just catches up with me.
My final question is, how would you like best to be remembered?
Well, I'd like to be remembered as a competent trial lawyer and a lawyer of integrity. I strove for that. My dad always told me that your reputation is the most important thing you've got. I also am proud of these Layman family history books that I've written, because they've helped a lot of people to trace their lineage, and a lot of folks are interested in that. Some folks are, some folks are not, but the work I've done has helped people who get their line back maybe to the mid to early 19th century and get stuck, and then they can connect to the work that I've done working downstream from the immigrant. So it's been a good deal of help to a lot of people in that respect.
Well, Earl, it's certainly been a pleasure to interview you here today, and I believe that we're now out of time, aren't we?
Well, it's been an honor for me.